I'll turn it over to you. And Lacey, I know you're waiting on her. So
yeah, thanks. Thank you so much for inviting me and my colleague, Miss Alicia Lacey, she goes by Jones, and myself back so that we could share with you during a lunch and learn opportunity. And she's actually going to be logging on a little bit later. She's in a different time zone, but also in a training doing some federal projects. And so I'm really excited for her in all of her endeavors, and so thankful for her as my colleague and a dear friend. So she'll hopefully be able to join us in just a little bit and speak through a few of the slides. We aren't going to overwhelm you with too much content, but just give you some resources to enjoy at a later date, and you're welcome to reach out to us if you want to go deeper or learn more. I certainly would love to learn from some of you as well, and maybe we could just kind of, since there's not too many folks in the room, does anybody have a feel for what sort of your professional backgrounds are or connections with environmental justice? Maybe that might be a good place for us to start, since we're kind of being a little more informal right now. Anybody feel like piping up?
Hi, good to see you, Meredith. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, so most people know I'm in the Department of Social Work at ETSU, and my scholarly areas are Indigenous research and environmental justice. So, as you know, it's a passion of mine. And when I saw that you were going to be here today, I was like, yeah, I put aside another meeting so that I come and listen.
You're too kind. Thank you.
Good to be here. I'm going to shut off my camera so I can eat my lunch.
Absolutely. Yes. Everyone carry on as you need to. Thanks. Anybody else feel like introducing yourself or kind of perspectives on where you're connected with environmental justice or just interested in it?
This is Diana. Thanks for being here. I'm excited to hear this. I, in my college days, was very into environmental advocacy, and now I'm very into diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. So I'm just really excited to see these two topics intersect, and looking forward to learning.
Oh, thanks. Well, good. Well, if anybody wants to put more information in the chat area, we can see those. If you have questions throughout, you're welcome to kind of stop me and interject a question or share an idea. Again, this is a lunch and learn. I know it feels more formal because we're on Zoom, but I still want it to be a more informal setting so that you can be involved and interactive in this. And again, I thank you for coming, and hopefully you'll have something to take away from this and something that you can share with us and your colleagues here on this call as well, so that we can all learn from each other. So our presentation is looking at the actions at the nexus of environmental justice and diversity, equity, inclusion. And here in UNC Greensboro, we started using some vocabulary around anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'd like to go ahead and insert that here as well. And let's see if my slides will advance. And before I jump into more content around this, I always like to start presentations and classes just pausing and being very mindful and opening with an acknowledgement. So I'll just read this. We would like to acknowledge Indigenous and First Nations peoples worldwide whose land, winds, and water we now all share. I would like to pay respect to their beliefs and their values and their continuing and enduring cultures which deepen and enrich the life of our global community. UNC Greensboro is a community of learners situated in a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. And we acknowledge that the land that we gather on has long served as the site of meeting and exchange amongst a number of Indigenous peoples, specifically the Kiawe and the Sara. And so we'll try to get a lot done in a short amount of time during this lunch and learn. We'll do some introductions, maybe a little bit of background on some of the topics in case some of the vocabulary is unfamiliar to folks. I'll just assume that it is. You may be enriched in these concepts for a long time, but if you'll indulge me just to start at the basics. And then we'll talk about some of the actions, some of the examples from the community that we are involved with ourselves, and a nonprofit that Lacey and myself started. So then we'll have a little time for question and answers. But again, if you have questions or things that you'd like to insert throughout, please just join in. All right, so myself and my wonderful friend and colleague, Miss Alicia Lacey Jones, and she is the founder and the director of the Ideal League. And that is a nonprofit that we have recently started together. It's just in its infancy. We just got our nonprofit status very recently and are still moving forward with that. I myself am a associate professor now. Sorry, I didn't update the slide, just got tenure. And so also in UNC Greensboro, working in the social work department, teaching environmental justice and undergraduate classes for diversity, equity, and inclusion and anti-racism, and also have in my spare time as a volunteer worked with the International Federation of Social Workers and launched the climate justice program with them. And there's some open access resources that kind of relate to a lot of this, including climate migration, which is one of the main topics that I have researched and worked on, because my life before academia was actually as a case manager doing work with immigrants and refugees in North Carolina and South Carolina. And so that's sort of what I do now with students, as well as sort of shepherd them through their process of learning and internships working with international populations here in Greensboro. Okay, so we just kind of wanted to pause for a moment in the midst of everything. I appreciate other people juggling lots of things at the same time and even eating lunch and pausing your life. But this is something I teach my students, and I have to really practice myself is practicing mindfulness. And that's so that we can be present, so that we can acknowledge the worldviews, the perspectives that we're coming from, acknowledge the systems that we're working within and the context. And so it helps us not only in our own well-being, but also in our radical self-care, which is part of community care. And so this is a quote by Sonia Renee Taylor, who's one of my absolute favorite authors. And this quote she put out there right at the beginning of the pandemic. Honestly, it just sort of really reached into and connected with some concepts that I have adopted, sustainable life enhancing pace. That's sort of this bar of, should I do things? Is it sustainable? Maybe, but it might not be life enhancing. Is it life enhancing? Maybe, but it probably isn't sustainable. You can't keep going at this rate with all these things. So it's sort of this balance and act. And so a sustainable life enhancing pace. And I realized that the pandemic took a lot of things away from people that we're still processing, we're still reeling from it, we're still dealing with the long-term consequences of loss of loved ones and the context that we have had to keep pivoting, a euphemism, I guess you could say, for all of the things we've had to keep pushing forward. And I guess I'm trying to look at the things that have changed during the pandemic for the good, that we actually enhanced our life and that maybe helped us create a more sustainable life enhancing pace, and that we might want to continue doing now that life might be quote unquote back to normal. And then that's what brings me back to this Sonia Renee Taylor quote, and I'll read it out for everyone. We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal other than we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return, my friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature. And so I just encourage you don't have to share out loud, but to pause and think about the things that have changed, that have enhanced your life and led you to more of a sustainable life enhancing pace. That as we're moving back into what our universities and organizations might assume is getting back to normal, but how do we want to reject what was? How do we want to build this new future that is sustainable and that is something that we could be proud of being part of and feel hope. So with that in mind, it brings me to thinking about worldviews. So a colleague and I, Michaela Wrinkle, we created a platform, honestly, for lots of social workers and community folks to share their resources. And it came to my attention, honestly, during graduate school, that I had what was a human-centric or anthropocentric worldview, and that other people had other worldviews. Some were eco-social focused, and I didn't even realize it. These platforms, we started inviting people to contribute to, and we've turned it into workbook series, and they're free and available for anyone to download. And some of the chapters are actually around worldviews. And we wrote this preface to it, thinking about these two fish swimming along, and another fish crosses their path and says, "Hey, how's the water today?" And they all said, "Oh, yeah, good." And then they kept swimming, and they thought, "Man, what is water?" Right? These fish are so immersed in it every day, all day. They don't stop to even pause and think, what is water? And so I try to say, let's pause and think, what is our worldview? What is it that we are operating within this context? And we don't even realize. I didn't realize that I was operating within a human-centered worldview, and that I thought that humans were sort of at this pinnacle and being stewards of everything, and that sustainability was part of our role and mandate, but I didn't see us as being part of the ecosystem, sort of outside or above the ecosystem, and things were there for our benefit, not that we were all living in an eco-social kind of framework of that we're all living in a symbiotic, interrelated, harmonious opportunities if we would operate within that worldview. So I think a lot of what the previous quote that Sonia Renee Taylor spoke about is coming from those human-centered anthropocentric worldviews and the systems and structures that we've put into place that uphold those worldviews. And in order to dismantle that and move, we have to kind of shift and embrace what are eco-social worldviews. And I have worldview here, but really it's worldviews. There's, many. These recognize, again, those interconnections with all of life in our ecosystem and promotes that fair and sustainable use of resources. And I still don't really like the word resources because it still sort of others things to be at the benefit of us as humans. So we'll pause there on that word resources, but to enhance those relationships, seeing the relationships and the well-being, and to critically examine and question modern societal structures, values, beliefs, practices, and all of these ways that have actually led to a climate crisis that we're in, amongst other pandemics. So we have over-consumerism, materialism, human-centeredness, over and outside of, again, the environment, and that oppression that we do to people and the planet is all stemming from those human-centered worldviews. So what we really need to do is have this shift, this redirection of how we see the world, and then the ways that we operate, the policies, the procedures, the advocacy that we'll do will really start to mirror something very different, a different trajectory. If you'd like to explore your worldview, there's actually a really cool chapter in volume 2 of that workbook series that Michaela and Peter put together. And I have all of my students look at it. There's actually a scale in there that you can kind of assess some questions and think, where is my worldview fall in this thinking about sustainability and worldviews? And certainly it's about diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. Another piece of that equity is how much of the planet do we consume with our footprint? And I won't ask you to do this footprint calculator now, but I encourage you, if you haven't used this resource, it's really cool. You can key in sort of like how you drive, what kind of car, or how much you eat of plant-based versus animal-based diet. I mean, there's different pieces of this calculator that can tell you basically how many planets it takes to sustain your lifestyle. And if you're consuming more, then other people are consuming less. There's just only one planet. We don't have 5 planets to sustain a lifestyle of luxury that I may have, that I want to, drive and fly all over the place because I'm a world traveler. I love to fly. That's my biggest footprint. And so honestly, during COVID, that's kind of set and grounded me. And so it's actually been really good for the planet and made me reevaluate my worldview and thinking about my lifestyle and my choices. So I won't push that any further, but please do use that as a resource and go check it out, and start to consider ways that lends itself to a sustainable life enhancing pace, but also the equity pieces. So we have these wicked problems that are certainly no clear solutions. There's not just like, if everybody could do one thing, we would solve all of these, right? They're so wicked. There's just so many things. If you start pulling at one and working on it, then you realize it's connected to these other pieces. But they're so enormous and so important that we have to work on them. Obviously, environmental degradation and climate change, those natural disasters that are actually exacerbated by human lifestyle, honestly, the anthropocentric worldviews that have led to exacerbating those natural disasters. And then we have global poverty and inequality, violent conflict, all of the discrimination and power dynamics within relationships, human rights violations, colonialism and neocolonialism. And so again, it's like you could spend your entire life just working on one little piece of these puzzles, right? And I'm sure all of you are doing fantastic, amazing work, and it might feel overwhelming, but I think that they're so important that we have to do something, right? We have to move forward together. And so for me, I started thinking about the climate crisis. And again, it came from my work. Growing up, honestly, it was more about, I cared about environmental issues and sustainability, and justice issues, certainly. And then I came into social work, and at some point I realized that I could kind of marry the two. And then once I was done with my social work degree, originally I was working in refugee resettlement and immigration services. And that's when I started to connect the dots of people are being forced to migrate because of quote unquote natural disasters, or even the opportunities that seem to be violent conflict, but what are they fighting over? The resources or the opportunities to live on safe land, or so on and so forth. So the climate crisis really became sort of front and center for me, if I could follow that domino effect back and say, how can we address this from a justice issue? And so again, that climate crisis directly is connected to human activities, and we exacerbate it. So just to clarify a few of the terminology within this realm, environmental justice, ecological justice, climate justice, they're not all interchangeable. So ecological justice and climate justice, I do kind of see those as interchangeable. I think people probably hear climate change so often now that climate justice might be a little bit easier connection for them in their brain. So I tend to use climate justice, but I really do see those as the same kind of broad umbrella that talks about, from an eco-social worldview, that it's justice for the entire ecosystem, all species, not just for the humans within the ecosystem. Environmental justice is under that umbrella. It's certainly a piece of it, but it's focusing on the impact to human populations. And it just happens to be from an environmental standpoint, like that's the burden or the lack of benefit that the humans are enduring. And that's why it becomes a justice issue. So that's a very more narrow, human-centered focus on environmental justice. And it's certainly, we are a species. We all need to address the justice issues at that level as well, but not to the extent that we ignore the whole ecosystem. And so I like to kind of make sure that those those three terms are a little bit delineated. And so environmental racism obviously is within environmental justice, and those very specific ways that environmental justices play out in those communities that are more vulnerable to storms, for instance. They're not able to recover from those tragedies due to economic constraints. And again, they're just further being neglected and not being prioritized when other governments and entities come together to kind of rally to either help mitigate ahead of time or help with recovery afterwards. They are often not prioritized, and that is often due to environmental racism. And so a lot of those examples, you know, the hurricanes, Lacey, my colleague, she's has family from the town of Princeville in North Carolina, one of the first established Black communities post-slavery. And they were basically given land on the Tar River area that always will flood. I mean, it's in a floodplain. It's constantly being in jeopardy every year when we have hurricanes. And they were given that because it was less, profitable, less desirable land from the get-go. And then now they're not being prioritized every time a storm comes, every time people need to mitigate for disasters, every time people need to rebuild their homes and deal with flood damage. So that is, again, environmental racism and those continued examples there all across the world, but that was one right here in our backyard in North Carolina. So obviously there's issues all over the world, global opportunities to learn. These are some other examples that I would encourage you to check out if you're interested. And I won't go too much into this because I'm trying to be mindful of our time. This is just an example of latrines in Uganda by one of my former professors and great mentor, Dr. Terry Wolfer, who came along as a social worker to join biologists and chemists and all these folks that were saying, hey, we need to deal with water quality issues. And they kept bringing in technology year after year, saying, how can we get you clean water in this this town? And they said, okay, we can't figure it out. What's going on? It either breaks down or there's power dynamic struggles or, whatever's happening. So when the social worker came to the scene, they were able to have a community meeting around one of the, community trees. And they said, okay, where do people poop? Like, what is going on here? And what is the dynamic of, waste and how safety issues come in and gender issues come in and all kinds of things that keep creating unhealthy situations in the environment for the humans and other species there. And so they basically decided amongst themselves from a ground up grassroots perspective to create little co-ops to build latrines. And then they had small co-ops who owned, so they had the ownership, they had the power and privilege dynamics shared, and they had small grants from the government to create these latrines. And I just think that was a really interesting way that, again, from a sustainability and environmental justice issue, we think, oh, just give people clean water and these, huge technology. But it doesn't have to be like that. It can be from a much more grassroots perspective and there with the local people being the experts in their own settings and saying, what do they need and how can you prioritize that and equip them to get what they need. Other pieces of this wicked problem, obviously, is colonization. And I show this to my students, honestly, just to jar them, to see that this is a euphemism. The Oxford Dictionary says colonization is the action or process of settling among and establishing control over indigenous people of an area. And again, that just seems so mild that it almost makes me cringe to think that people are perpetuating this euphemism. So I try to challenge them to say, from a decolonization lens, how would you restructure that? How would you reframe that so that it really calls a thing, right? And I really love Feluke's Africa. This author offered this. What is decolonization? The process of revealing and dismantling colonist power in all its forms. This includes dismantling the hidden aspects of those institution and cultural forces that had maintained the colonialist power and that remained even after political independence. So again, those frameworks are still entrenched, and how can we dismantle those from, again, I believe eco-social worldviews come into play when we start thinking about decolonization as well, and creating the place for that to occur. Again, I came from this background of resettling refugees and immigrants and looking at climate migration as one of the push factors that creates the need for people to migrate under duress. I love to travel the world. I love for people to travel the world, and I would welcome anyone, anytime, but I don't want them to have to travel if they don't want to. I don't want it to be under forced migration and under such horrific instances where people are having to flee for their lives due to what we think might just be a natural disaster, or what we think might be that it appears to be a political conflict or a religious conflict or whatever the case may be, but really there's so much more going on connected to the whole ecosystem and how those things come into play. All right. I thought I saw Lacey joining in. See if I can see if she's there. I thought I saw her just come in, and I'm gonna turn it over to her if she is here. She came in at the right time. Okay, so she's trying the phone. I can skip ahead to a few slides and then I'll pass it to her as soon as she comes in. I saw her and then she might have disappeared. So now this is sort of the meat of the presentation, thinking about the actions, like what are we going to do with all of this as we shift our worldviews, as we try to come at it from eco-social worldviews, decolonization, all of the different justice aspects. How can we then put it into action? And so some of the actions I will let Lacey share a little bit more about if she joins us, but the reason that we came together was actually looking at the climates of inequality. And it was a big sort of, I don't know how to say it, a big research project done by many different universities. Rutgers University kind of called us all together and said, let's look at stories of environmental justice from climate migration. And so we looked at sort of local within North Carolina, thinking about the Underground Railroad and migration, as well as the global migration, and thinking about how people have migrated to Greensboro, North Carolina, and resettled as refugees. And so we came together, her as a community member, myself within the university, in this partnership about 5 or 6 years ago, and just really hit it off during that research project that we were able to involve her community in the town of Princeville, as well as a lot of my students in some research and dissemination that this will be actually touring the country. So if anyone's interested. So this is a little bit more of the detail. We're actually hosting an exhibition of the traveling exhibit from all of the different universities that have contributed to this. And so it's actually coming here to our local area very soon. Actually, I guess February starts tomorrow. And then it's traveling the country. And during COVID, obviously, there were some hiccups with a traveling exhibit as people couldn't get out and about. But these are some opportunities that we were able to be involved in locally to really connect with these global and local climates of inequality and migration. And let's see, this is a photo of Lacey and I traveling right here in my backyard to the Guilford College Woods that has this magnificent tree that's part of the Underground Railroad. And I actually take a lot of my classes there for field trips each semester. And then Lacey was able to come join me, and we were able to go visit this tree and sit under it and write poems and read and just kind of commune together. And I think you're on there now, Lacey. Are you with us? Can you hear? Maybe. You're muted. If you can unmute yourself, that would be good. No, maybe not. All right, maybe technical difficulties. That's okay. She carried it last time when we had technical difficulties and I couldn't get in. So we'll just keep rolling with it. That's okay. So together we started the Ideal League. This was Lacey's idea, thinking about literacy materials and how they were not representative of the diverse client populations that she was working with some after school programs. And then it just, really became a passion of hers. She shared this with one of our colleagues in a lunch and learn class, and I attended that, and I said, how can I help? And from those conversations, we came together and collaborated and started this nonprofit called the Ideal League. It's implementing diverse, equitable, accessible literacy. And so the main reasons for this is to create opportunities for people to see themselves, especially children, to see themselves in the literature, and that talks about all different topics, but also for us thinking about climate justice as well. Since that's sort of the topic of this, we're going to hone in a little bit and focus on that, but we certainly have lots of different objectives within the whole aspect of the nonprofit. This is Lacey doing some of the lunch and learn opportunities with various books that we have in our acquired in our library, as well as some that we're trying to share and give out to daycare centers, schools, after school programs, lots of the places where there's really gaps in the opportunities for folks, for children to see this. literacy. And this is one of the main reasons that a lot of children's books actually have, obviously, the primarily white characters as the center, and then animals. So they might hear the story, they might hear about climate justice, but it might be only focused on animals as the main character, as if they're little children that these folk, the kids are trying to identify with, right? Versus seeing themselves in the literature, seeing themselves as part of the actors involved and part of this ecosystem and part of the ways that we can move forward together. So this positive representation, there is a lot of amazing literature out there, but it just hasn't been accessible to a lot of folks. And then there are still gaps in the literature. So we're trying to fill some of the gaps actually around climate justice literacy itself. So there's, again, the content that we're trying to focus on at this nexus of environmental justice and climate and diversity and equity and inclusion, as well as the way that we can get it to folks, how we can get it into the hands of children, whether it's through libraries and equipping, daycare centers, or all the different ways that we can fill those gaps. We're actually starting scholarship programs to help children who want to learn to be illustrators themselves and to write books. And so again, the ways that we can create content, but also deliver the content around these topics. And so the Ideal League, again, focusing on climate justice literacy specifically, was to think about, for instance, this photo of a tomato. Lacey and I have discussed many times how we regret not growing up knowing how to grow vegetable gardens, that both of our families had come from, farming backgrounds and gardening backgrounds. And then once you kind of arrive, you don't have to grow your own food anymore. You can go shop and buy it. And now we're saying we don't have food literacy. She was saying how she just learned to compost, and how I'm trying to teach my daughter how to garden and grow tomatoes, and I'm doing probably a better job of showing her all the ways not to grow a garden, but trying to at least show her that, food does grow, and kind of getting over the fears of the dirt or the snakes or the bugs or whatever. So lots of those different aspects, and seeing those as not predators or things that we're working against, but how can we work with, like the soil, the nature aspects that, again, we're part of, not outside of and removed from. I see you now, Lacey. Can you hear me? You want to join in? Can you get your voice unmuted?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we got you.
Oh, great. Hello, everyone. Sorry about the technical difficulties. That is the world we live in, but I'm glad I was able to jump in. Yeah. So Meredith was talking about the Ideal League. That was one of our visions as we go forth in regards to including and making things more accessible and diverse, right? And so as she was talking about climate justice literacy, I don't know what slides we're on, but I just wanted to address one of the questions in the chat that is a part of our programming, making sure that we get access to a lot of the books that are not as promoted. And there's a lot of barriers in publishing world and things like that. So making sure we vet them. And so yes, a list of books is something that we have curated, but have not publicized it yet, but it is one of our items. But we definitely have a few that we will recommend. There's a couple on the next slide, I think on the next slide, that we'll go over in regards to all the resources that we want to share with you all, since we are very, in a short lunch and learn time. But yes. So with the literacy, and then also climate justice literacy, that's one of the aspects of the Ideal League, just making sure that those who are in the world of literature and, public school education overall, some of the literature that I know myself and others have grew up on has been very one-sided. And then also just making sure that in climate justice that we look at certain things that have been ignored, like indigenous knowledge, and then certain ways to get more in tune with the ecosystem and how we are part of the ecosystem. as this world continues to change. That is definitely one of the environmental justices as well as climate justices to introduce that through books, especially at a young age, which ideally wants to cater to the youth as well as those who are nurturing the youth, which is adults and systems around the youth. We want to make sure that we promote the eco-social worldview because we are also included with our nature and our natural environments around. Oh, these are the few books that Meredith can speak to as well.
Sure, yeah. So The Wump World is one that I grew up on by Bill Peet from back in the 70s. Again, doesn't have the human characters. It does have some sort of alien characters that are called the pollutions. I don't know if anyone grew up with the Lorax, but I didn't have that one. I had the Wump World. So again, this one sort of anchored me from a very young childhood, understanding climate justice and the injustices to this, the Wump World, the planet, and these cute little animals, the Wumps, versus the grandiose cities that were created by the pollutions who came and inhabited and kind of paved over everything. And it actually ends with a happy note. You know, the pollutions finally leave and there's like a little blade of grass coming up through the concrete jungle, and the Wumps come back out of the cave. And so it ends on a hopeful note, but it also probably as a kindergartner really impacted me, probably put me on my trajectory, and was, again, this piece of storytelling that became so powerful for me as, you know, as an educational resource. And now I even use children's literature in my college classes. Some of the examples of books are so powerful, but we need to enhance the accessibility to the ones that really are good, and then also fill in some of the gaps. So maybe you know of a gap that you want to write a book, or you want to say, hey, I haven't seen anything on this. Do you know of any resources? And we are trying to curate some resource lists and share those more broadly. Again, we're kind of in that infancy of starting this nonprofit, but we welcome others to join us, to be involved, and to see how you can join us in the actions at the Nexus.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I definitely would like to add to that. So on our website, we'll introduce a sheet, not a sheet, but a form that you can fill out, and we were welcoming suggestions or recommendations in regards to like anything that you may have seen that is not in a book. That is probably out there, but again, a lot of these books and authors have barriers that they're trying to jump in that world of literacy to get these at the forefront. I know my personal story, which resulted in some of the vision, is that when growing up, I did not see me on a cover. However, I read books quite frequently. That was just something in my household and my family dynamic that was very important. And so I know I learned a lot and was exposed to a lot in my literature. But again, there was a misrepresentation. And so there's a lot of the objectives that on our website that we mentioned. And I think there was a slide and that resulted our objectives that we wanted to focus on. And so certain categories like culture, family dynamics, race, and differing abilities, things like that. I have not seen as much that it needs to be, as our world is diverse, but putting those type of books out in the forefront. So when you go on our website, you will see like read-alongs or read aloud some of the activities that we have done in the community with certain like child centers that wanted to partner with us. And so introducing some of those books to the center, to the teachers, to the advocates, so they can incorporate that into their lesson plans, is a good way for you all to start if you see our website at the end. But yeah.
Good. Yeah. And the other two photos on this slide just happen to be other books that are recommended. Obviously, one of my absolute favorites in the world now, Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend that one. Definitely a game changer for me, for my own worldview shaping, as well as helping as an educator. And then just thinking about The Last Child in the Woods, that idea of nature deficit disorder. How much time are we spending quote unquote away from nature. And people are like, oh, let's go and get back to nature and reconnect. And the truth is you can't reconnect, you can't disconnect. You are nature. We as a human species, we're part of nature. So instead of saying reconnect, we say, how do you foster those connections? And so again, it might be just helping children understand like what is safe and, you know, in your own backyard or in the woods. Sometimes, again, I take, like I said, my students on the trail walk to go visit the beautiful tree that's a landmark or part of the Underground Railroad. And it may have been the first time some of these students who are practically adults have ever gone into the woods. So again, all of these aspects of climate justice literacy, the music, the technology, the food justice, are different ways that we're trying to say actions can occur. Certainly I take my students into gardening opportunities. These are some free permaculture gardens in Greensboro that we have gone to visit and learning about. There's a community farm right outside of Greensboro in Whitsett, and it's called Peace Haven Community Farm. It's intentional housing and inclusive housing for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We did a photo voice project out there together. I've become really good friends with a lot of the folks out there. They've done presentations with me at social work conferences and come speak at my classes. And again, this is another way that we're kind of increasing the climate literacy and involving people themselves in sharing their own stories. Another opportunity that we had was at an older adults, a senior center. Now they've renamed it to the Smith Active Adult Center. And we came alongside the Parks and Recreation Department and the Junior League of Greensboro and got some grants. And they already had a little playground, but they had these very old dilapidated tennis courts. And we said, okay, this community has been very underserved, very neglected. The city is now ready to put some funding towards it because we as the university and we as the community nonprofit have said, how can we help with older adults in our community? And we said, why don't we revitalize this park, get people back outside? So they built one of the state-of-the-art pickleball courts. And some sidewalk area, gazebo, sitting area, and kind of made it a joint intergenerational between the playground and this pickleball court. And it's just been a really great thing for that community, that neighborhood that had been very underserved. There's sort of a before and after picture. And so I was really thrilled about that. One of my colleagues had done research there for her dissertation several years past. And really gathered the data from the people in the neighborhood to find out what they wanted, how they wanted to improve their community. And then as I mentioned before, the climate justice program within the International Federation of Social Workers is something that I started as a volunteer on the side. Love for anybody to be involved in. It's not just for social workers, but again, it's sort of thinking, how can we be more mindful of our impact as we travel the world, as we create policies? Say this lunch and learn was together and we all had water bottles and we all catered, you know, all of those policies and procedures that we are sometimes not as mindful about. How can we start thinking about our impact and our decision-making power from these eco-social lenses and maybe change the policy and say we can only cater, you know, local organic foods, or we can only get, you know, recyclable products, or, you know, whatever it could be at a very a micro level at your organizational level to broader things, looking at climate migration. I'm working right now with colleagues thinking about how can we reclassify refugee status to include climate refugees, which is now not part of what is accepted within the refugee status application. So again, those huge policies could be changed from a human rights standpoint to smaller aspects within your own footprint, if you do that footprint calculator or share that with your students. But I encourage you to check those things out. And then these are the resources I mentioned that my colleague and I, Michaela Rinkle, co-edited. We also contributed a couple of chapters within these, but it's really shared from many of our colleagues around the world and community members as well, contributing different chapters. And the chapters themselves have like sort of short stories or content, and then they have questions and applications, like exercises you might want to use with your classes to get them thinking, or in an organization if you want to do like continuing education opportunities. And again, all of these are free. and made available as free PDF downloads. These are some other inspiring actions that Lacey and myself came together and felt like we wanted to really highlight these. We won't share every single one with you, but these are some that we really encourage you to check out that are at this nexus of environmental justice or climate justice, that broader term, and DEI. So these are some opportunities that we encourage you to explore. We certainly want to save a little time now for some questions and answers. This again is more resources that you'll have access to these slides if you would like to see other ways to become involved. There's some music that is always inspiring to me. You want to jump in there, Lacey? I see you come back in.
Oh, yes. Yeah, a lot of the resources, and again, we welcome you to email us if you want more information on any of these resources that we are recommending or suggesting. There's context to it in regards to how we end up coming about this or these resources. Personally, as well as professionally, ended up in our lives. And so we definitely wanted to share. And then also one of the other things in regards to the Ideal League and our programming that we're going to initiate, I think she shared like poems and, you know, advocating for creative writing. So a lot of the youth that we want to empower, that's one of the programming in regards to like writing our own things that we feel that there's a gap in the literature that we are aimed to be studying in our school or in our education, because it just definitely needs to be more inclusive, and we have to be intentional about that. And that is definitely one of the intentional objectives of the Ideal League as an action, to fill in some of those things, you know, for instance, in regards to environment, there is a very big fear of lizards amongst some of my family members who have never saw a gecko come into their home. But I was exposed to that as a little kid, and I remember reading about them and I remember seeing them. However, depending on regions and where you live at, certain exposures are not enhancing your ability to be able to be comfortable with certain things. And that goes down to food, that goes down to certain things like in the garden, you know, just indigenous native land things. And again, we just want to translate that into a book at a younger age where all of these things are missed and end up being a disparity in opportunities and achievement. And then of course, the educational gap. But those are the actions that we want to include. But yeah, questions.
Yeah, I was going to mention too, the additional, not just fear of nature if we haven't had that literacy and upbringing, but the very real fear of being out and about in a body that is Black or brown in this country, for instance, that is not safe to go for a bike ride, to go for a run, to sit at the park with your children, those different ways that then it becomes an environmental justice, environmental racism specifically, because they don't get the benefit of connecting with nature and fostering those connections because of those very real threats to their lives. So those are other aspects as well that need to be, you know, talked about, need to be highlighted and rectified through actions. And part of that is the literacy. How do we start from an early age and get people understanding these things? Yeah. And so, yeah, thank you, Lacey. I'm going to stop now. Again, these were some of the resources that we just made available, and we won't go too much into them, but question and answer time. Thanks.
Thank you all for the wonderful presentation. I just want to make the folks who are participating to be aware that the recording is, you know, this is recorded, and they will have access at a later date if they choose to, and they can share it with their colleagues here on campus as well. So they will have access to your slides and all that information.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And as we look at this photo here, it's another activity
rock painting as well, and leaving the rock if you want to, but leaving that message or that artwork in our nature as we paint. I have done that with a couple of groups of my own to reconnect with our land or your neighborhood. And then the story behind it is someone walks by and then that community is like, well, who left this rock? So it could have been like a love or happy, but a lot of kids in the neighborhood have gotten used to playing and rearranging the rocks, as well as being reaffirmed with the rocks as they're reading them and painting them and then relocating them. And it turned into a little game activity within a neighborhood that I did it in community-wise.
Meredith, you brought up a good point there in terms of environmental justice. I never really thought about it from the standpoint of, you know, just not feeling safe to go and enjoy some of the things that others will enjoy. I know I've been invited to go hiking at times with colleagues, you know, on the campus. And some of the places that they've identified that they're going to go, that's 3 and 4 miles back in the woods in these very secluded areas. I don't feel very comfortable doing that and have always chosen not to go because of the fear of what could potentially happen, just based on things that have happened in the past and those kind of things. So yeah, I never thought about it from that perspective because I have a tendency to stay on the beaten path and try as much as I can not to get off. Right. So I don't enjoy some of the things that other folks from this region will enjoy by choosing not to go hiking on some of those places that I didn't think would be safe for me.
Yeah, that's
yeah. Thank you for sharing. That's exactly it. Yeah, well, I also was trained to stay on the path. Do not veer off.
Yeah, Lacey and I were sharing about our childhoods experiences being obviously very different, and I rode my bike all over the neighborhoods, and Lacey was sharing about how, you know, her parents cautioned to her about riding bikes and keeping safe. So again, that is very much an environmental injustice from an environmental racism specific point. I've spoken with a doctoral student here who is looking at African-American males and mental health and their interactions with their children. And again, for me, I just kind of said, hey, have you even thought about how they may or may not take their kids to a park or take their kids on a trail walk or take their kids, you know, to do gardening or this, that, and the other. And a lot of that may stem from those environmental racism aspects that are so ingrained, and you may not even be aware of it. Again, that what is water from the very beginning of our session today, sort of, you just are swimming along and you don't even realize how much it's impacting you. So yeah, but how can we now bring this to the forefront, bring these conversations, create spaces where people can be safer? Obviously there's no completely safe space, but where we can be brave and bring these opportunities together. Other opportunities that are actions, you know, there's different hiking groups of Black females that are getting together. There's lots of different cool opportunities that people are saying, hey, how can we come together with people with disabilities and get outside and take our caregivers outside? And they've created nature trails so that someone could be pushed in a wheelchair and be off the beaten path, if you will. So there's many cases and instances where people are starting to be more mindful of how can we be more equitable and inclusive as we consider many aspects of diversity, and then thinking about it from climate justice aspects as well. Yeah. All right. Anybody else have a question or want to share anything? We appreciate y'all letting us be here today. And this was a little photo of a fun friend that I met, I think somebody called it a tobacco worm. It looked like a caterpillar to me. And I didn't pick it off of my tomato plant because I thought I have enough tomatoes I can share with this other species that's bringing me joy, and did a lot of harm, ate a lot of leaves. But the next day I came back and this little leaf had a cutout almost in the shape of a heart. And I thought it was like a message back to me for letting this cute little creature live in my tomato plant. And so I thought of sharing that again, as I'm learning my own food literacy and I'm trying to teach my daughter, but also trying to say, how can we be an interspecies collaboration and not feel like we have to be othering even other species. So yeah, thanks. All right, there's the resources as well. And if you want to get in touch with us, we had our contact information at the beginning of the slides, and we would love to hear from you.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Okay. And the ones who participate in the session, they also receive a short evaluation form. We ask that you complete those. That helps us to kind of keep going. And Chastity may want to add something else to that. Anything that you want to add, Chastity?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Powers and Ms. Lisi. This was a wonderful presentation. In the chat, there is a evaluation for you to fill out, everyone that participates in the Lunch and Learns. This just gives us feedback on how to plan for future semesters. We always welcome your feedback. And then, of course, this was our first Lunch and Learn for the spring 2023 semester, and we look forward to seeing everyone here next Tuesday for Chastity Drew. She will be presenting on learning to communicate across cultures. So we look forward to seeing everyone next Tuesday. Thank you again and have a wonderful day.
Thanks. Bye.